David stood outside the waiting room, a place where he had spent months building his career. The glass door reflected the luxurious space he had helped create, but today it felt like an invisible wall, blocking him from entry. The words were soft, almost polite, but they cut deep, like a knife through his heart. "You don't look like a first-class passenger." No velvet ropes, no bright neon signs, just the cold, stern gaze of a woman who decided who belonged here and who didn't. In his wrinkled cotton clothes, David was ignored, while a man in a tailored suit walked through, immediately greeted with a prepared glass of water. David Carter, the name on the boarding pass, but behind the borrowed glasses and the old backpack was David Hale, the man who had turned a startup with a two-lane road into a national airline. Today, that name meant nothing. Today, everything was about appearances. He stood still, expressionless, and pulled out his worn notebook, continuing the familiar note. Not allowed. Each entry in the notebook was not just a personal record. It was a buildup of emotions, an observation and analysis of everything he was witnessing. None of this was accidental. It was a system, a culture embedded in every employee, from their smiles to how they judged a person, based solely on clothing or appearance. In the past 10 days, this was the 23rd time David had been rejected for something he couldn't change: the clothes he wore. He sat in the hard plastic chair, listening to the sounds around him, the faint smell of burnt coffee and the too familiar scent of perfume. Everything was unchanged, yet he felt as though he had been erased from this reality, leaving only the heavy silence that filled the space. "Can you endure that silence without reacting?" David asked himself. "Will you remain silent or speak up?" He felt the pain not only from the discrimination, but also from the torment of having to stay silent in the face of such obvious injustice. These moments kept repeating themselves, like an invisible game from which he and people like him could never escape. That was when he realized that it wasn't just him who was being treated this way. Everyone around him, whether they had dedicated their lives or were struggling day by day, could fall victim to a system silently harming them every day. And in those moments, he wasn't just a passenger on a flight. He was an observer, a witness to a culture that was falling apart. David sat there, his gaze fixed on the misted glass door, watching as each person entered and left. The men in well-tailored suits walked through like victors, greeted with warm welcomes and treated like first-class passengers. A middle-aged woman holding a child in her arms pushed a small stroller aside and walked up to the counter. She looked around, her eyes full of expectation, but was met with nothing but silence. The baby continued to cry, tugging lightly at her mother's collar. But none of the staff standing nearby moved. Not a single person stepped forward to offer help. The staff's eyes were directed outward, deliberately avoiding the woman struggling to care for her child. A man in a perfect suit walked up to the counter, and immediately he was met with a bright smile and full assistance. The staff gently took his bag as if it were the most precious item. David couldn't help but notice the stark contrast. It was like a play that we were all unknowingly participating in. The woman with the young child, her patience and exhaustion evident on her face, was overlooked. Meanwhile, the man in the fancy suit, though he hadn't asked for help, was served with all the enthusiasm. David felt the bitterness. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern that had been established for a long time. He continued to write in his notebook, documenting every detail. It's not just about appearance. It's about the attitude determined by what you wear. This image kept repeating itself in his mind, not just here, but at every airport, in every flight he had taken. Every action, everything revolved around a system where some people would be favored while others were left behind, all based on perception. And none of this was accidental. It was a purposeful setup. Looking back, David realized that he wasn't just a witness. He was a victim of an openly discriminatory system. He had once built a powerful airline empire, but right now he was just an anonymous passenger, standing outside the door with a backpack and old clothes, unnoticed by anyone. Not because he didn't meet the qualifications, but because he didn't meet a standard that this system had created. And that was when David realized he had to do something. He couldn't let this silence and injustice continue. This system needed to change, and he would be the one to lead that change, no matter how long it took or what challenges he had to face. David sat silently, watching the crowd go by. the fluorescent lights glistening as they reflected off rushed faces. Brief conversations, hurried glances, everything felt like a never-ending loop. But in that moment, David's mind could not be still. Each time he saw a passenger, each time he witnessed a smile being cut short, or a cold glance, he felt an invisible force pulling him into a deep place inside. He couldn't remain invisible to the people around him. They only saw the outside of him, not realizing that behind those worn clothes and old shoes was a story. A person who had built an empire, endured hardship, and above all, promised never to let anyone feel this way. David picked up his pen and tapped it gently on the table. A new line appeared in his notebook. Self-respect isn't something you can overlook. He realized that respect couldn't be bought with money or clothes. It had to be built through the smallest actions, through the way we perceive and treat one another in daily life. But not everyone saw this. The airport staff, the people who had only met him for a few brief moments, couldn't see the pain he was experiencing. They couldn't understand that every action they took deeply impacted those they encountered. David couldn't just stand by and accept it. He couldn't live in a world where a person's value was only measured by their coat or shoes. He had to act, not to change things immediately, but to open a door so that at least those who silently suffered could feel that they were not alone. He stood up, his resolve firm. He looked at his notebook, no longer filled with trivial notes, but with undeniable truths. Every line in it was a warning, a reminder of what he had witnessed and what he would do. No matter how long it took, no matter the obstacles, David would not let this battle end without change. David stood before the waiting room door, feeling the dim light reflecting off the glass. But all he saw was emptiness in his heart. Not because he had once been at the top, but because he realized that in the world he had built, people too easily judged one's worth by outward appearances. He remembered the woman from earlier, the one holding the child, her tired eyes, her lips pressed tightly together when no one would help her. The looks of those around her were nothing but cold indifference, but no one saw the strength in her eyes. No one saw the pain of a mother waiting in scarcity. David sat back down in the hard plastic chair, his eyes staring out at the airport, where people of all shapes, sizes, and moods blended together. He could see unfamiliar faces, each carrying their own story, but they all seemed to exist in an invisible system, a system where those who didn't meet certain standards were left behind. Each story, each moment, kept engraving itself into his mind. He had seen an elderly soldier dismissed for an expired loyalty card, a woman carrying her child having to haul a heavy suitcase with no help. These weren't coincidences. They were a system that had been put in place, a system where humans were no longer seen as people but as numbers, as objects judged by first impressions. David sighed, flipping through the pages of his notebook. He had written down too many such stories, too many moments he couldn't ignore. These stories would not be forgotten. No matter what, he wouldn't let these people, these stories, fade into obscurity. He remembered once, when he was young, sitting on those same cold plastic chairs at the airport. No money, no help, and no one looking at him as a person. That night he had promised himself that if he ever made it, no one would ever feel invisible again. And today he knew that moment had come. He no longer wanted to witness these scenes. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He had to act, even if the road was difficult. He wrote another line in his notebook. Every small action has the power to change if we have the courage to act. David rose from the chair, his heavy footsteps carrying a burden he couldn't put down. The lines in his notebook echoed in his mind, each page a reminder of the injustices he had witnessed. The silence of the airport, the indifference of those around him, made him feel as if he was living in a different world. A world where human values were overlooked, replaced by sharp judgments, prejudice, and unreasonable discrimination. He walked up to the reception desk where a young staff member stood, eyes glued to the screen with an expressionless face. David placed his suitcase on the counter, his gaze unwavering, without a smile or any sign of greeting. The receptionist glanced at him, then nonchalantly gestured for David to take the ticket from the self-checkout machine. A wave of frustration surged within David. He remembered the early days when his company had been founded, those months of struggling to bring true value to customers. Back then, every customer was valued. There was no discrimination. Everyone was treated with respect, no matter who they were, what they wore, or where they came from. But today all he saw was a cold system, where a person's worth was measured by their appearance. Just a calculation, right? David asked himself. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push away the rising frustration. He couldn't accept what was happening before his eyes. He knew this wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of the company's culture, a culture that never accepted differences, never accepted imperfection. And that, whether he wanted to admit it or not, was trampling on the very values his company had been built on. David stood still at the counter. A couple stood in front of him, dressed casually, showing no signs of prominence. When it was their turn, the receptionist didn't hesitate to direct them to a priority area. They received warm assistance from the staff. Meanwhile, David realized he had been overlooked once again. Once again, he felt like he didn't belong here, in a place where appearance, wealth, and status were the only measures of value. He turned back to his seat, his notebook still in his hand, his eyes focused on the pages that had already filled up. He had recorded 24 times that he had been turned away, 24 times he had witnessed these unbelievable moments where people were ignored simply because they weren't good enough by the system's standards. Each entry was a promise he had sworn to keep. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't just stand by and watch this discrimination persist. No matter how difficult it was, no matter what he had to sacrifice, he had to do something to bring about change. David wrote one more line in his notebook. To change, we must start with ourselves. Only when we face the truth can we change the system. He picked up his pen, writing one more line. Change will begin where we least expect it. David sat there, the light from his computer screen reflecting on his face, making the shadows of a long day more pronounced. He couldn't shake the thoughts running through his mind, the images of those who had been left behind, the looks of indifference. The moments he had witnessed in the past days still lingered in his thoughts. The image of the woman with her child, the elderly soldier with trembling hands, and the young student pulled out of line simply because of their modest clothing. All of it was a wound to his soul. He knew the time had come to make a decision. When the door to the meeting room opened, David stood up, his legs feeling heavy, as if each step carried a weight he couldn't put down. This meeting room had always been the place where he felt most at ease, the place where discussions on strategies, financial plans, and leadership were held. But today, that feeling was gone. Everything had changed. He walked into the room, where directors and managers were seated around the long table, their faces still confident as if nothing had shifted. They were all dressed in expensive suits, their attire symbols of power and success. But David no longer saw power in their clothes. He only saw deceit. As he approached the head of the table, the silence in the room became palpable. No one greeted him, no hands were extended. David placed a thick folder down on the table, the sound of it cutting through the air. All eyes in the room turned toward him, but no one dared to speak. "We've been wrong," David began, his voice calm but resolute. Every word he spoke felt like a sharp blade cutting through the tense air. And not just wrong in strategy or finance, but wrong about people. We've allowed appearance, clothing, and age to define a person's worth. He looked into the eyes of each person in the room, not blinking once. We've built a system where people are not valued by their abilities or their integrity, but only by how they look. And that is something I cannot accept. The tension in the room grew thicker. Some people tried to avoid his gaze, not willing to face the truth he was speaking. The entire room remained silent, but the change in the atmosphere was clear. David continued undeterred. We can't keep maintaining a culture where those who silently give their all, those who don't have impressive appearances, are not respected. Our system is suffocating the very values we've built. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. He didn't need to continue. These words were enough for those sitting in the room to feel the responsibility they carried for maintaining an unjust system. And from now on, I won't stay silent, David said, his eyes filled with resolve. We will start over. We will change this culture. And this change will begin with our actions, not just policies. The room remained silent. David was no longer the leader they had known in the traditional sense. He wasn't the one standing at the top issuing orders. He was the one confronting the truth, the one stepping forward to confront the invisible wall that had been built. The meeting ended, and the door to the room closed behind him. Change couldn't happen instantly, but David felt that the first step had already been taken. He was no longer just an observer. He had become a part of the change process. And with every step he took, he knew the culture of the company was about to transform. David walked out of the meeting room, a sense of exhaustion rising within him, but also an unusual feeling of calm, as if he had completed an important part of his journey. He knew he couldn't stop here. This change, though difficult and likely to face resistance from the conservative forces within the company, could not be halted. The silence that followed the meeting was telling. Everyone had understood that this battle was not just about business strategies or profit margins. It was about a revolution in how we view human beings. David arrived at his office, where the light from the computer screen reflected on his face. He sat in his familiar chair, looking at the control board, and began working. His words weren't empty declarations. They were those of someone who had witnessed too much injustice. Too many people left behind simply because they didn't look right, didn't dress well enough. He couldn't let those things continue. Everything had to change, and that change would begin with the simplest of actions. David started drafting a new plan, not just about policy changes or company structure, but a revolution in how people were perceived, starting with the smallest actions. The people working in the lowest departments would also be heard, respected, and valued, not judged by their rank or appearance, but by their true worth. He also began contacting his close colleagues, those who shared his values. Together, they would form an advisory group, made up not of directors or senior managers, but the employees who were truly working at the ground level. They would be the ones to reflect the truth of the company, pointing out things the leaders might not see, so decisions could be made based on the real needs of the workers. The meetings, the discussions about concrete measures were tense but full of hope. David knew that to bring about change, he couldn't do it alone. He needed the help of people with the same vision, people who were ready to stand up for justice and fairness in every decision. When the meetings ended and discussions about specific measures began, David felt something he hadn't in a long time. He hadn't just changed the company, he had changed himself. He was no longer just a CEO, he had become a leader who made bold, decisive decisions. The next day, David stood before all the employees in a large company-wide meeting. He didn't stand on a podium, wear expensive clothes, or create any formal facade. He wore a simple shirt, jeans, and sneakers, just like an ordinary person. He looked at the faces in the crowd, some full of curiosity, others filled with skepticism. But he knew this was the moment they needed to hear what he had to say. David started by sharing his own experiences, the moments when he was judged simply by his appearance. He spoke about his journey from being an ordinary worker to becoming the CEO of the company. And most importantly, he shared the promise he had forgotten but would now keep: respect for all people, no matter who they are, what they do, or what they wear. These weren't just theoretical words or philosophies. They were words born from personal experience. They were affirmations of the most important value in the company: respect. We will no longer judge anyone based on their appearance. We will look at the true value of each individual, and from that, we will give them the respect they deserve. And that will be the foundation for every decision we make from now on. The room went quiet, and then a round of applause broke out. This was not an immediate change, but David knew that once the path was set, nothing could derail it. Finally, David stood in the airport, watching the planes take off in the sunset. He felt the shift in the air, in the smiles of the employees, in the glances from the passengers boarding their flights. This was a victory, not because of numbers or financial results, but because of what the company had done for the people within it. David took a deep breath and whispered, "This is the real Skybridge." Everything began to change immediately. The tension that David had felt before in the large company meetings was replaced by a sense of listening and understanding. The employees who had once felt overlooked and disrespected now began to feel valued more than ever. Departmental meetings were no longer just exchanges of work information, but became platforms for sharing ideas about a company where everyone had a voice. David didn't just stop at changing how things were handled internally. He knew that to truly make a difference, The company needed to show this commitment to the outside world, with customers, partners, and the community. So, in the company's promotional campaigns, the message of respect and fairness was made clear. The advertisements no longer focused solely on the sleek images of luxury planes or extravagant services. Instead, they centered on the message, every passenger deserves respect, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they wear. This wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise that David and the entire company would uphold in every situation. Every employee, from flight attendants to check-in staff, from airport managers to maintenance teams, underwent retraining, not just in their professional skills, but in the core values the company was now building. Respect, equality, and non-discrimination were at the heart of it all. One notable change was the creation of a Customer Advisory Council, a platform where every customer could provide direct feedback about their experience. This wasn't just a simple survey, but a real space where customers felt heard and respected. Their stories would be collected and reflected in the company's meetings, ensuring every decision made by David and other leaders was based on the actual needs of customers. David also introduced a new initiative. Every director and senior leader would spend 1 week a year working directly with employees in lower departments, from housekeeping to customer support. This would provide leaders with a better understanding of the daily work employees did and create opportunities for direct communication with those working under pressure. These changes weren't easy. David knew there would be resistance, opposition, and even setbacks along the way. But he was prepared for the challenges. With the support of Ela Mercer and trusted colleagues, David was determined to stay on course. A month later, at a company-wide meeting, David stood before all the employees, looking at the faces of those who had stood with him. We've changed part of the company, but there is still much more to do. I want to thank all of you for trusting in the values we are building, but the most important thing is that we will never forget this. We will always respect every passenger, every employee, and no one will be left behind. The room went silent, and then a round of applause erupted. This wasn't an immediate change, but David knew that once this path was chosen, nothing could divert it. In the end, David stood at the airport, watching the planes take off at sunset. He felt the shift in the air, in the smiles of the employees, in the looks exchanged by the passengers boarding their flights. This was a victory not just because of the numbers or financial results, but because of what the company had done for each person in it. David took a deep breath and whispered, "This is the real Sky Bridge." Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.